Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Other Side of Truth. And unlike previous episodes where I've dug deep into the vault of time to pull something out I did 10 years ago, I'm actually here right now on Skype with the one, the only, all the way from Los Angeles, California, Greg Bishop.
Ta-da! Hi, Paul.
Oh, that's nice. It's like Radio Mysterioso without the radio and without the Mysterioso. So what's cool? What's new? What's still keeping you excited in the world of the paranormal? Anything. Doesn't have to be UFOs. Doesn't have to be ghosts. But what is sort of got your attention these days? Is there anything?
Probably the only thing that left where I see something novel and I have some hope, and I read the literature is psychic stuff, especially the kind of stuff that really pisses people off, like skeptical people. Everybody thinks I'm turned into the skeptic or something. It's not. It's because that. Nothing I see is exciting or new, really, anymore to me. Not many things are, at least in the paranormal, because it's the same stories over and over again.
Right.
What's interesting, what becomes interesting is something that you might have control over, like remote viewing, or most recently, and I kind of pushed this just to see how many people would get pissed on a couple of sites, apparent teleportation of matter into little film canisters being done by some people in China. Which, of course, you can't check on it. You don't know if it really happened. But the thing is that people, instead of saying, "Hey, let's try this over here," or "Let's try and replicate the experiment," the 99.9% of the time, the reaction is, "That's bullshit," and those people are lying. Like, why don't you try the experiment with an open mind and see what happens? I can go into it a lot more detail, but I won't. It was an article in the SSE journal, which I've subscribed to for many years now, the Society for Scientific Exploration. Bunch of credentialed scientists who look into cryptozoology and UFOs and ghosts and orbs and things like that and actually do experiments with it and report their findings, positive or negative. And more than half the time they say, well, couldn't really find anything here. Doesn't mean there's nothing there. It just means we couldn't find anything this time. Somebody else should try the experiment or try it with slightly different controls and protocols on it, and we'll see what happens. And I like that attitude. That's a true skeptical attitude about these things, and that's what excites me, is like intelligent people from a traditional background taking a risk like that.
Well, let me throw an idea to you to sort of bring it back, the psychic thing. It's interesting to bring it back to UFOs for a second, or at least the idea of extraterrestrial life, aliens somewhere out there. Typically when we hear of people, contactees, for instance, or even abductees, they would say the aliens have come down and talked to us, met us in person, or they abduct us from our bedroom or whatever. They're here. They're floating around the earth. They're here. What do you think about the idea of aliens who are far in advance of us not being here, but having the ability to send through space and time messages to our subconscious, if you will, that maybe we can't quite perceive, but appear to us in the form of dreams or some sort of phenomena around us, if you see where I'm heading with this. So we might be, in fact, making contact with a higher intelligence, if you will, that is not God, but could be aliens from Zeta Reticuli. They could be extra-dimensional beings, something like that. Do you think there's a sort of a focal nexus there? I don't even know if that's an actual term, but it's 3:00 in the morning, a focal nexus. Do you think there's a nexus there, maybe between?
It's redundant only. That's all.
Yes. Is there a nexal focus?
Yeah. Okay. That's the title of the radio show now.
Nexal focus. Nice. Sounds like an 80s punk band or something. Yeah. Do you see the possibility?
Band. Yeah. The funny thing is, you've hit on the crux of the thing here. I think that there's kind of a connecting link, or a nexus, if you will, where all of this paranormal stuff meets up. And I think it has something to do with what you just mentioned. Something that we might call interdimensional, or paraphysical, or time travel, or wormholes, or whatever you want to call it. Things that seem to defy what we think are immutable physical laws. I think that stuff is starting to crumble, and I think we're seeing evidence for it. And the other thing, which I've thought for a long time, especially when people think there's aliens or whatever, and I don't discount the ETH, however much I complain about it, and you do and Nick does. I don't discount it. I just find it uninteresting. But the thing is that after all this time and talking to all these people and writing what I've written and learning from people who are far smarter than me, and talking to researchers that have actually been out there with their boots on the ground, so to speak, for years and years, I get the very distinct impression that there is an extra-human intelligence interacting with us, some sort of intelligence that is not human that is interacting with us. We have a lot more, and I've mentioned this on a couple other shows, I think we don't give ourselves nearly enough credit for what we think our perception of UFOs, especially UFOs, are. And I'll put cryptozoology, cryptids, and other psychic-type phenomena a little further down the list. In fact, other stuff way down the list. That our co-creation of what we think UFOs are and abductions are and all that, I think we're a huge part of that equation, like more than 50% of it. And I'm not saying that there's nothing there. I'm just saying there's definitely something there. But we've got so much baggage, psychological and cultural baggage, that we can't hope to meet it on its own terms for quite a while yet. I think we will eventually, but we're always going to be co-creating with it our perception of it, if that makes any sense.
Yes, actually it does. It's interesting because when I was going through the vault, I pulled out an interview I had done with Stan Friedman just over 10 years ago. It was a pre-interview I did before we went into production on Stanton Friedman is Real. And, the usual stuff, MJ-12, Cosmic Watergate, all that, which if you're going to talk to Stan, you need to talk about that stuff. But towards the end, I just started asking questions about, what do you think of NASA? What do you think of SETI? What do you think? And then I said, what do you think of religion? And what our reaction might be if we discovered there was an extraterrestrial civilization. And Stan started talking about things like reincarnation. He said flat out, he finds reincarnation as a concept very interesting. Science should be taking a look into it. He didn't quite get into talking about things like higher consciousness and psychic phenomena and all this sort of stuff. But I think people think that Stan's not open to that. The truth is he is. He's just not interested in it, and there is a difference. He's focused on our aliens coming here. There's no harm in that. It's just that's what he's focused on. Other people are focused on other things. Whereas I think guys like you and Nick and our late friend Mac and even me tend to take a more holistic approach and go, well, that's interesting, but so is this. And is there some sort of linkage, perhaps, between all of these different things? A unified field theory of the paranormal, if you will. And so I find this idea, as you were talking about, psychic phenomena, higher consciousness. I mean, on one hand, it all sounds very new agey, and it's easy to write it off that way because there are a lot of kooks who talk about it. But on the other hand, the more that you get into sort of cutting edge science, talk to a guy like Michio Kaku or any of those people, they'll tell you we have so far to go in our own development that, where will we be in 100 or 200 or 300 years? Well, then imagine where some other beings might be in 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000. A much better idea, as Stan said to me, of spirituality, of what we would call spirituality, of that sort of thing. And I actually, talking to Stan 10 years ago, I remember I found that fascinating. And I also thought, why don't you talk more about this? Because this is a very interesting component of the UFO phenomena. And, it's just not something he's terribly interested in talking about. But, so the whole psychic thing that you were talking about, I find that very interesting. That idea that maybe, something is communicating with us from wherever, whether it's in our future, whether it's on another planet, whether it's in another dimension, or whether it's, this is weird, whether it's within our own mind and we don't realize it.
Yeah, which makes it no less fascinating or worth talking about, because it seems to be coming from somewhere else in some cases. We talk about these things. We talk about all the stuff we've been talking about on the show and what we've been involved with for many, many years, all the weird stuff. And we don't realize the whole time we're involved in this huge trap of our own language. And our language traps how we can think because it makes us think in certain ways. If we were speaking in Japanese or Chinese or Hindi or something like that, I wager we'd be speaking about this subject in a different way. Not completely, but different enough that it would be quite noticeable to somebody that knew both languages. And then there's the state beyond language where people try to describe a mystical experience or anything having to do with spirituality, psychology, a mixture of the two. And once again, you're trapped by language. And that brings to mind the quote from Dean Radin that he told me when I interviewed him many years ago. And he was applying it to psychic research. He said, trying to do psychic research with the instruments we have is like trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. That's how I feel about language sometimes when we're talking about this weird stuff. We're using the sledgehammer-like language to try and talk about something that's very subtle and maybe not fleeting, but just not amenable to the tools that we have to describe it, which is our language, and therefore our thought patterns, which are determined by our language.
It's interesting because the most fascinating conversations you can have, I think, are the ones you have with yourself, because you're not really bound by language. The way that you can be walking down the street. I take nightly walks, and I don't talk to myself. People don't see me actually talking to myself, but you're talking to yourself. You're having this conversation with, sometimes usually without even knowing it. But there's so many things that can go on in your own mind when you're not constrained, as you say, by language, by trying to then I could be sitting there with 8 very intelligent people, but they're all different, which means now I have something going through my mind, an experience I've had or a thought that I'm having, and somehow I have to filter it down and make it intelligible so that all 8 of them are going to get it. Which brings me back to, or leads me to another question, I guess, which would be, we have all these groups, whether they're MUFON in the UFO world or whatever groups they are out there. And I used to think that groups were good. Now I'm less convinced that groups are good. Now I'm more convinced that it's a very personal, very solo exploration of the weird and the wonderful and whatever. Or at best you do it with a few close friends.
I agree completely.
Well, that's no fun.
Yeah. Well,
what do you think of the Giants winning the World Series then?
I think it sucks.
Okay. Good. There we go.
Mostly because of their fans. Anyway, there's a very distinct Northern-Southern California dichotomy that I've been reading about recently, and this is in a book that was written in the 1930s, and that's still going on. But the only thing I would disagree with you, sort of, here's some excitement. You said that when you're just talking to yourself or dealing with thoughts, you don't have to worry about the language. But the language where you pulled all the information in to get those thoughts is still affecting how you think about it. You're still thinking in probably a fairly linear fashion, I guess, or you're dealing with ideas that have been communicated to you by language in a lot of cases.
Sure. I don't disagree.
But in your defense, if there's any way to possibly get out of that, it's by that personal thought process or speaking with people who are willing to use the shorthand of the things that you're talking about and the ideas you're kicking around to express things that probably can't be expressed exactly, which is why you get excited when you meet somebody who's basically finishing your sentences, because you know that you have the same shorthand and you can start dealing on a different level. Here's
an interesting idea. When you're writing a screenplay, I was working on one, and I've got this scene where a guy and a girl are basically, they're going to get it on. So they're going to make love and all that sort of stuff. And I was going through all this thing where I had dialogue, like what would he say to her? What would she say to him? How would they get there? And I just took all the dialogue out and there's descriptive patterns in the script because you need that about, hey, here's what happens. But basically he just shows up at her house. She shows up at his, or it's, they see each other. They look at each other for a moment, and then he makes his move, and the next off they go. No words, no language, nothing that could complicate it, nothing that would take away from the moment. They just do it. And yeah. I think it's a lot of it. I learned this, or experienced it, if you will, from ghost investigating, or whatever you want to call it, experiential type stuff, like going out and actually having the experience, I think is tremendously important. But I think we're so divorced from that in modern society. We're cell phones, we're on the go, we're watching TV, constantly connected, if you will. And we don't take that sort of Henry Thoreau moment. I'm not saying you need to spend a year at Walden Pond, but we don't
out there.
Yeah, we don't even spend usually. How many people actually spend, say, half an hour a day at Walden Pond, whatever their Walden Pond is? Really?
Yeah.
How many people who have cell phones who are listening to this now could go out for coffee by themselves, just read the paper or sit there or watch people? I used to do this on the trains when I was young in Scotland all the time, people watching. Just sit there, no cell phone, nothing, and just say, you know what, I'm going to go back to my office or wherever I'm going when it feels right. I'm not even going to say I'm going to be out for an hour. I'm just good. Just do that. How many people actually do stuff like that? I think very few. And I find as I get older and more interested in the experiential side of life, always been interested, but even more so, I do that more and more often. I want more and more walled-in moments, whether it's climbing a hill in Scotland and just sitting there and watching the sunset, or whether it's sitting in a coffee shop watching people and just seeing the interactions around me. All of that stuff I think is tremendously important. And I think the danger is as we get more technologically advanced, we are moving further and further away from our ability to actually access the much more interesting things about us and our world that we could be accessing. And technology is not helping. It's hindering us from doing it.
I will talk to people younger than me who I work with, and I tell them I've been to, Canada because of you, or been to Europe, or been, flying somewhere. I got in a plane last week and went up to Oceano Dunes halfway up the California coast, pulled my paraglider out of the back of the airplane and went running up and down sand dunes with my feet floating in the air, 10 or 15 feet off the ground, basically sort of like running in a dream. And they're flabbergasted. They either have no idea what I'm talking about and they give you a blank stare, or they're flabbergasted that people actually do that.
Yeah.
You know what that thing is for me, that reset or whatever you want to call it, is being up in the air somewhere, either in a plane or a paraglider or something, especially if I'm totally by myself. Because I don't know what it does, but it's some sort of reset. My thought patterns are reset by doing that.
I know, I can tell.
It's meditation. I mean, the total concentration of something like being a pilot is a meditation. It really is. And the other thing that came to mind when you were talking about nonverbal revelations or thought patterns of communication or whatever, the only way we get that anymore, really, and probably the way most people have gotten it for hundreds or thousands of years, has been through art.
Yes.
And I'm talking about novels, filmmaking, maybe especially visual arts, painting and film and video and all that, because you don't have to, like when you said they communicated without speaking, that's what cued me to that, because that one of the few ways that we can communicate something to somebody else without having to explain it, just by showing them this visual language, which will cue these circuits and feelings and patterns in their mind. And just by communicating that to them, it becomes personal for them too, because you meet somewhere emotionally and intellectually at the same time in the middle. You're both contributing to it, the artist and you as the person looking at the art, which sort of gets back to the UFO thing. And I think that's where a lot of the nonverbal communication, the most useful nonverbal communication, happens. You know what's weird is a lot of things affect me very deeply emotionally when they didn't used to do that. Like passages of electronic music are doing that for me now from the 1950s, or the last 15 minutes or 10 minutes of True Grit. I was in the back of the theater basically biting my lip and sobbing, and I don't know why.
Well, it was a brilliant film. So, and the best films are, designed to elicit those kinds of emotions. Don't laugh. I actually had tears in my eyes a couple of times. I went to see Country Strong. Now, I am not saying that's an Oscar-worthy film. It's good, but there are moments in it when you can just tell, like, whatever, it resonated with me. Maybe because of my own music career or something. But there's nothing going on. All they're doing, it's not even when she's singing. It's the music that's being played, the way a scene's constructed. For me, music's an interesting one. I agree absolutely about art. But music's interesting because
I would definitely include music in there. That's why I mentioned it.
I'm convinced that if we're sending messages out to aliens, if there are extraterrestrial civilizations, here's what we should send. We shouldn't be broadcasting I Love Lucy. We should be sending Bach. Just send that out and go, hey guys, listen to this. That's who we are at our best. If you want to understand humanity and all the various emotions and all the baggage, but all the good stuff that we bring, listen to some Bach. That'll pretty much do it for you.
Or Kodo music, or American Indian chants, or
Gregorian chant, same thing. You can find absolutely, and I'd throw some Sex Pistols in there too, and maybe some Paul McCartney. But music, and then I'd send out art. I wouldn't send photographs, because I love photography, but to me, photography is the equivalent of modern music, whereas art is the equivalent of classical music, where it can be abstract, where it can mean many different things to many different people, and maybe the message isn't clear upon its, sort of first look. Paul Davids, our friend Paul Davids, has, I don't know if you saw this up on Facebook, but I'll put a link up to this when I put this show up. Paul's a very good painter, besides being interested in UFOs and a fine filmmaker and other things. And he has this series of paintings that he did that he's now put up on the internet. And I didn't know I knew he painted, but I didn't know he was this good. They're fascinating. None of them look really like real-life representations of anything. They're obviously a bit skewed. But I actually find them more compelling. He has one about cars on a street, I think, in Europe. I'd rather see that than a picture of cars on the street in Europe.
There's about, 3 zillion% more human emotional content in that than a picture of cars on the street, unless you're an extremely good photographer, which some photograph, like look at Ansel Adams' photographs, even his photographs not of mountains and things.
No, absolutely. This is not me demeaning photography as an art form either, because there's my friend Finley, when we were working together, is a great photographer. And, he created some wonderful photographs that are very mean. But, something about the old school stuff. It's because I'm getting older, Greg.
Well, whatever resonates with you. Like I said, I've been listening to Dutch electronic music from the 1950s, and it's gotten me and there's no words in it. There's not even sometimes there's not even a beat in it. And it has been affecting me quite deeply emotionally, and I have no idea why. Maybe it's just a complete novelty sound of it. It's unhooking me from all the other programs that are running through my mind all the time, having to do with music and other things, but mostly with music. And that, to me, that's a real aesthetic moment. Or what's the name of the philosopher? He wrote Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell. Okay. He said that was there's a few times where you can have a moment of aesthetic arrest, which means you're just completely overwhelmed by whatever the art is doing to you at that moment.
Yeah. Well, do you know the band, Icelandic, I guess, very good friend of mine introduced me to them, Sigur Rós?
Nope.
Yeah, you should listen to them, because basically they create soundscapes. And the soundscapes are, the only thing I can think of to compare them to is Radiohead, when Radiohead goes at their most experimental. So the soundscapes are amazing. But then when he sings, I thought, well, okay, he's singing in Icelandic, right? So that would explain why I don't understand it, talking about language. Turns out, no. He's usually singing in a language he, as I understand it, has created for himself. Really, the only person who gets it is him. And I'm not even sure he gets it. But his voice... Yeah, his voice has just become another instrument. It is melding, it is meshing, if you will, with the music, and he's going with the flow, which makes me believe that every time they perform one of these songs, it's probably slightly different.
Yeah.
So, that I'd send some of that stuff out to the aliens too. The things that we concern ourselves with are so petty. It's my history background, and I've been reading a lot of history. And, you can read about these guys in fighting in 1807, 8, 9 in the Indian Ocean, the French and the British, and I'm sure it all seemed terribly important to them at the time. But 200 years later, almost nobody remembers it, and it wasn't important. What was really important would have been the development of ideas that were taking place. Is the human race moving forward as an entity, if you will, the race itself, all of us, towards something better as people? And, I think we were for a long period of time. I'm not so sure we are anymore. That's what gets me, if I'm going to be curmudgeonly and depressed, I would say it's not because we haven't discovered the truth about UFOs or whatever. I would say it's because we don't even really look anymore, and we don't have the capacity to look. And anybody who thinks they're looking for the truth about UFOs, I would say, even to those people, you're not really looking, if you know what I mean. And I think you do.
Well, if you really were looking for it, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you, because it could not be communicated. That's the other thing. I've gotten to the point where I think that, and I've actually said this for a long time, that people say, do you want the answer, or are you trying to whatever? And it's like all this idea of what they think somebody who writes and does these kind of things wants to do. And it involves, signing books and being famous and being on TV or whatever, although I've never really been on TV. but the thing is that, and I've said this in interviews and I've written it and all this, and the thing is that I'm not looking at what I'm looking at so that for any, I don't know, it's not really an ego thing. It's more like it's something that I want an answer to, so I'm looking for it. And I just happen to go through the motions of writing about it and telling other people what I'm thinking once in a while. If you listen to a band, that's what they're doing, if they're a good one. If you follow an author, that's what he's doing. If they're a good one. I'm not saying I'm good, but the motivation, the motivation, unfortunately, is selfish.
Yeah.
For any good work, be it art or journalism or whatever the hell, I think that the motivation is selfish, and the communication of that, of what you find, is secondary. If it's good.
You're doing it for yourself. I will grant you that. You're trying to, whatever music, art, same thing with filmmaking, songwriting, any of that stuff, As John Lennon once famously said to some guy who showed up at his door and said John's songs meant a lot to him, he said, well, that's great, but, I write them for me. And any of us who are artists in any way, that's why we do it. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think I didn't say it was bad, but I think people have the wrong idea about it. No, quite so. But that's why I'm saying the use of the word selfish, which carries pejorative connotations. I would use a different word where I just say it's a journey of self-exploration for each individual. And if every one of us was taking that journey of self-exploration, I think we could all be artists. And I think as a whole, the community that is the human race would be better off for it. The problem is so many of us rely on other people to do that for us. For any one of a number of reasons, you have to pay the rent and all that stuff. I get that.
Yes.
But you can still find time to do it for yourself. People used to write journals all the time. These were not authors, not people intending to be published. Many of these journals have gone on to become valuable historical artifacts, and they're quite literary. But they were never intended to be read by others. They were people writing them to themselves. I think we should all do that. Write a journal. If not every day, once a week, make an entry. How was your week? Just that kind of idea. Do something, anything artistic. That's one of the things I liked about Mac. He was always doodling. He's not an artist. He wasn't going to sell his art, but he would just doodle. Things, he'd be on a plane, and I have some of the doodles he did on a trip out here for the New Frontier Symposium. His parents sent them to me. And, he was just doodling on cocktail napkins and stuff. But it was his way of kind of processing what he was seeing and remembering it. And I think that's he's not Picasso or whatever, but he was an artist even in that way. And I think we all have the capability to be that kind of artist. The problem is I think we worry about, well, okay, how are we, what are other people going to think about it? Well, who cares? And that's what the real artists, the ones who make a career out of it, they can make that leap. They make the leap beyond, I don't care, I'm just going to do it. But I think
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think everybody can do it, and I think everybody should stop caring about what other people think, because they should be doing it for themselves.
Yeah.
It's like dancing.
It can be as easy as carrying a little camera around.
Absolutely.
And I carry the camera. I've got this little, and it's so easy now and cheap. I've just got a little digital camera, and I've got pictures on there from like 5 years ago. And I've, every once in a while I erase some of the more uninteresting ones, but every once in a while I'll just sit there and look at the pictures, remember what happened then, what happened after it, how it related to my life, how cool I thought I was at the time, or just, hey, that was a cool picture of that moment that time. And sometimes I show them to people, but often I'm just looking at them myself.
Absolutely. When we were traveling a year and a half ago after we finished shooting a few episodes of Ghost Cases in England, Holly and I stayed over for 3 weeks, England, Scotland, Europe, and I noticed that she was taking pictures of flowers. Everywhere we went, she would be taking pictures of flowers. And I just thought, why are you taking pictures of flowers? Your memory stick only has so many photos, and focus on the important things.
That's how she remembers things.
Exactly. So I started taking pictures of flowers. I thought, well, okay, I like Holly. She's smart. If this works for her, I'm going to see if there's something to this. And as it turns out, I think I wound up taking more pictures of flowers than she did by the end. Just that idea that, flowers, something as simple as a poppy sitting in a field in the Czech Republic. And I find that, when I go back to look at the photos that we took, I like looking at 3 things. The photos of us, because those are people. That's important. I like landscapes. If you're in Scotland, I like looking at pictures of the Highlands. So that's great. And the other thing is I like looking at those pictures of the flowers, and I have no idea why. Weird. But there it is. So, yeah.
When you do these shows, do you usually talk about these things, Paul? I thought it's usually like UFOs and stuff.
No, I don't talk about these things. Everybody's tuned out by now. So, but these are, people. There's this controversy going on about abductions and David Jacobs, and it's, this is the brouhaha du jour. It's all terribly important to the people who are involved, and I'm sure.
Sorry to say, I just don't care.
I'm sure to the people who are actually involved, which would be David Jacobs and this Emma Woods person and anyone else who is directly involved, yes, it is important to them personally. Fine. But you know what? In the grand scheme of things, even within ufology, most people had already figured this out a long time ago. It's not terribly important, but it's what passes for news. So if my alternative is I can talk to you, whether anyone listens or not, about things like consciousness and art and how maybe that is all far more important, or I can talk about David Jacobs and Emma Woods or whatever else is the thing du jour, guess which one I choose?
Well, of course. And the thing is that if you really think about it, the stuff we've been talking about impinges on that kind of stuff in how we look at it and where they are in the importance meter. And just if you're interested in the UFO thing, what do you want to care about? People fighting about who did what to whom, or what the ultimate reason for all this weirdness is, and how does it affect you and the people you know and us in general? One of the many variegated forms which it takes is idiots arguing with each other. But that happens with anything.
Right, and I used to do it a fair bit myself a few years ago, and then I just decided, what is this accomplishing? Nothing. Wasting my time, wasting anyone else's time. I'm done with it. So let's just move on. And I think if people read between, I'll tell you what, folks, if you want to know, just picking on that David Jacobs, Emma Woods thing, if you want to know what Greg and I think about the alien abductions, listen to this show again. Listen to what we're talking about. Read between the lines, and I think we've already made our point. As far as I'm concerned, everything I've said relates to alien abductions, UFOs, all of this stuff. You just have to kind of, read between the lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why did I give a lecture about? It was at the New Frontiers conference about the UFO contactees being an unrecognized art movement.
Yes.
Now, I wasn't totally serious about that. I was not 100% serious about it in a literal sense.
Right.
But what I was doing was trying to get myself and other people to look at it in a different way rather than, were these people telling the truth or not? Yes. Oh, it's amazing. No, they're full of crap. I mean, that is, to me, that's like a fraction of a percentage point of what was going on.
Well, and I used to be, I'm not going to say your lecture was the defining moment of my life vis-a-vis contactees, but I remember it. Yeah, no, I'm not saying that. But thank you. No. Thank you for the Cartman reference. That's always good to get at least one of those. But Yes, excellent. No, that's Mr. Burns. Sorry. I remember that, and I remember thinking that, and I used to think that the contactees were all just crooks, frauds, hoaxers, whatever, some combination, or delusional, some combination of those things.
Yeah, well, that's part of it too.
It is, absolutely, but I think that was missing the big picture. I mean, at the end of the day, who cares? At the end of the day, you have a very interesting group of people who had an impact on American history, pretty small one, frankly, but at least, they made an impact. And maybe somewhere in there's some truth coming out of it. I'm not saying from George Adamski's photos of fake flying saucers, but maybe there's some truth about some element of who we are. Even if everything they say is fake and fraudulent, well, that's important too. So let's just look at this social movement. Let's understand more about human beings. And very new agey. Let's gain a greater self-awareness.
Self-awareness.
Exactly. And once we've done that, once we truly understand ourselves, if that's ever possible, but as our self-awareness increases, I think our awareness of all of these other things will increase too, which I guess is the point I've tried to make.
Yeah, and it's not – and people say increase like there's going to be a goal at the end where the self-awareness is aware and you're all self-actualized and all that. No, that's never going to happen. If you're honest with yourself, it's a continual process, just like the UFO thing for me and for everybody else I know has been a continual process. Well, not everybody. Some people get stuck and then they play that loop again over and over and over again. However, the people that keep me interested are the people that change, evolve, and change their opinion, and sometimes just get out of it. My friend Wes Nations, who nobody ever remembers now, but he had a magazine called Crash Collusion in the 1990s. And I met him through that, and we used to have these campouts called the Kook Out, which you've heard of.
Yes.
But that was basically Wes's magazine and our magazine, Excluded Middle, and all the interested writers, artists, and all that associated with it. We sort of had a little group where we could talk about something in that shorthand I was talking about. Wes, after he stopped publishing Crash Collusion, now he's traveling the world. He's like in Tibet right now for the last year or two. He doesn't care about UFOs anymore. Well, he kind of does, I guess, but people say, oh, well, that's too bad. Oh, poor Wes. Why is he doing that? Why didn't he stay with the UFO thing? And the only thing I can think of when people say that is, all right, do you want him to validate your obsession by staying in it? He moved on and he's doing other stuff now, and he looks really, really, incredibly ethereally, whatever, happy with it. If he hadn't done the magazine and been into the UFO thing and the drugs thing, the psychedelics, not that he was a druggie or anything like that, but interested in that and spirituality and conspiracies and all that, I dare say he would not be wandering the world right now as a traveler and just doing exactly what he wants.
You know what? If I hadn't gone to law, like it's how do you get on your path? If I hadn't gone to law school and then gone into the music industry, I never would have been in the film industry, traveling, meeting. I never would have met you and Nick and Mac, or really spent very much time, say, with Stan Friedman or any of these people. Wouldn't have made these films. Wouldn't have gone on these trips. I wouldn't have been in these haunted houses. I mean, it's all like you can't control where the road's going to take you. I mean, you don't want to go flying off the cliff. I think you should try and prevent yourself from doing that. But other than that, just make sure that you've got a full tank of gas and, you're good to go. It's like John Lennon, those 5 years he spent from 75 to 80 making bread or whatever, raising his kid. And then he comes back before he dies and he writes Watching the Wheels. He's just, what was I doing? I'm just watching the wheels go by. And I got off the merry-go-round. And I know everybody out there wanted, this would be Lennon speaking. He said, I know everybody out there wanted me to be making music, but I didn't want to make music. Whatever he was, burned out, he just wanted to live his life. And, I think that might be his greatest contribution in the 40 years of his life, was showing that you could literally walk away and have an enjoyable life. I was just thinking we sound like two old hippies. Hippies.
Hippies.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, well, maybe, but it's the I will give an example from my show. I had Bob Emenegger on, and everybody knows him as the guy who did the UFOs Past, Present, and Future, where he was supposed to get a film from the U.S. government, from the Air Force, and they said, yeah, we're going to give you the Holloman film. We're going to give you a film of an alien craft landing, aliens getting out, and one of the guys and one of the producers saw it, and it appeared real, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we talked about that, and we talked about government UFO stuff and what his perception of it was from his years in the biz and for people he had contact with. Obviously, it was one documentary he did, but it affected his life quite a bit. Real interesting stuff. Then at the end of the show, I talked to him about his stint writing music for the Lance Link Secret Chimp TV show from the 1960s. And I knew he'd done it. Somehow somebody told me I found out somehow. But I wanted to talk to him about it. And it's funny. He was really interested and really happy and really cool through the whole interview. And when I did that, you could tell he just lit up. Yeah. Nobody ever talks to him about Lance Link's Secret Chimp. I used to watch that show religiously when I was a kid. It was basically a show with a bunch of monkeys and overdubbed voices, and they played spies. It was really dumb. But he wrote all the music for it.
I had no idea. That's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, he goes, remember that band, the Evolution Revolution? I said, yes, Bob, I do remember them. And then I found it on YouTube. Somebody had posted it, and I played some of the music. And if that's curmudgeonly, then you have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's not curmudgeonly. It's showing that you have interests beyond, the UFO thing. I got roundly criticized. The 1 3-hour show I did on Coast to Coast, I've done a couple of shorter segments, but I did 3 hours with Nori when I was out in L.A., actually, back in 2006 when we were filming Best Evidence. So I did it from a hotel room in Santa Ana, And I remember because if you do Coast to Coast, I don't know if people know this, but you're doing it in real time. So when you get those long commercial breaks, they just cut you off.
Yeah, you're just sitting there.
Yeah, I think maybe you sort of hear the muzak that Nori plays to his subscribers. Fair enough. He's got other things to do. Great. Let me know when you're back. So I had the hockey game because the Stanley Cup playoffs were on, and I'm Canadian. And there was a Canadian team in the Stanley Cup. It was the semifinals, actually. Sorry. And the Edmonton Oilers were trying to get in, and it's rare these days that a Canadian team gets into our own, championship series. It's usually American teams. And they came back, and he asked me some question, and I got criticized by a number of UFO people, the usual types that criticize you, because my answer is basically, hey, that's fascinating, George, but, the Edmonton Oilers just scored, and, they're going to the Stanley Cup. And as a Canadian, I'm just taking this moment to the 6 million listeners or whatever you have, say, wow, screw UFOs, this is cool. And he laughed, and he took it in stride, and then we went on. He thought nothing of it. Yeah. But there were people who listened to that who actually wrote and said, Kimball trashed UFOs by taking this opportunity. He had this opportunity. Every minute is precious, and he took a minute or two to talk about the National Hockey League playoffs. What? Grow up and get a life, folks. That was my only reaction.
Just apparently.
Yeah, screw you. My thought was, you know what, if you can get on Coast to Coast for 3 hours, you can say whatever you want. But I'm guessing none of you can. But I can, which means I get to say whatever I want. And for 95%, 96% of the time, I talked about UFOs. But for 2 or 3% of the time, I talked about something I wanted to talk about. Because I was just excited. It was an experience, a moment. I think that makes it. Yeah, I think that makes it genuine. Like, I would love to hear Jacques Vallée on Coast to Coast. And when they come out of a commercial, he would be like, I cannot talk to you at the moment, George. I'm burning my grilled cheese sandwich. Hold on. And then you would hear something like, a fire extinguisher or something like that. Yeah. And Nori going, Jacques, are you all right? Oh, this is crazy. Be like, yeah, I will be with you in a moment. Run something from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I'll be right back. I don't know why my Jacques Vallée sounds like, this bad Eastern European mafia guy, but it's like Count Dracula meets Jacques Vallée. But no, that would be cool to have these guys. I would love that all of these shows should at least take. Tim Binnall does this. The first time he ever interviews you, Tim usually puts in some personal, like, who are you? What makes you tick? That's great. But so many of these other shows don't bother doing it. And I think that's a shame. And with Coast to Coast, the place where you really get to know who the people are, it's when the people call in. Because you get the craziest questions from the weirdest people, and it's how people respond to that you can really tell who they are. And so that's the best part of the show for me. In fact, when we're done, I'll probably tune into whoever's on tonight just to listen to the Q&A.
You're so much different from me. When it gets to that part, I usually turn it off.
Oh, I think that the older I get, I think that part of it is I love if it is Jacques Vallée or Michio Kaku, that's great. Absolutely fantastic. But when I saw Kaku speak in London a year and a half ago when Holly and I were there, I found the question, the audio was online, so I just posted it here. And he it was an hour-long thing at the RSA. He did a 22-minute long speech about his book and, basically buy my book. And it was interesting, don't get me wrong, but he gave the thumbnail sketch of what's in his book and, his standard speech. Fine. Yeah. I'm sure if you'd showed up in Birmingham the next night, he would have given the same speech. But then... Yeah. The 35-minute Q&A was great because here I got a chance to ask about a contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, but there was some other guy who asked him about cold fusion. Mm-hmm. And you could just see Kaku's face go like, uh-oh, cuckoo. And the moderator, try and shut this guy. And the guy was going, I've discovered a plan or whatever. And Kaku engaged him. And he said, more or less, you're crazy. But he said it in a nice way and explained why you're crazy. He just didn't say you're crazy. He said, look, this is why it can't work. So if you think you found, I think he even said, if you found it, come up and talk to me afterwards. He didn't mean it, but he was polite enough to say it. Yeah. And I found the Q&A far more interesting than I found his sort of canned lecture. So Coast to Coast, it's kind of the same thing. And so's a show. So I don't even consider this a show. It's a conversation between two friends that I'm actually going to put out on the internet, and people can listen to it or not if they want to. So.
Yes, well, that's the way it should be. That's how I run my show too. And usually, I have people on that I know at least sort of. I almost never have somebody on that I don't know at all. And when that happens, you don't know what's going to happen, which is fine. and I'm not. It doesn't make me nervous. But the thing is that just like you, this thing, I don't do a Q&A really unless the person really is into answering questions. If they're into having a conversation and they seem okay with it, I have a conversation with them and I contribute stuff. And I say what I want to say. Because, like we said, ultimately we're doing the show for our own edification and amusement. If other people can listen to it and get something out of it and be happier that day or learn something new or go further with it or start their own show or amaze us by the seed that we planted with them, that's great.
No, I agree.
It should be.
The more podcasts, the better, frankly, as long as they're podcasts where people are being true to themselves and talking about, whatever's important to them. Even if I wouldn't listen, those kind of podcasts or those kind of sort of exchanges of ideas are important. Here's a question for you, though. I'll ask, because we should wind it up soon, I suppose. If you could have one guest on Radio Misterioso that you haven't had, who would it be and why? Who would you want to talk to if you could only have one more guy or girl?
Art Bell.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I want to ask him questions. I want to ask him what his idea about what the show, what was his idea behind doing the shows? Why was he interested in the subject matter? How selfish was he about what he did with the show, to compare him to me and you and other people we know? Oh, God, what is his belief now? I don't give a shit what went on politically or anything like that, because apparently they kind of kicked him off there forever now. I don't care about that. I don't care about when he was off the air and then on the air and then there was a problem with his son being molested by his teacher and all that. I don't give a shit about that. I would ask him why he got into radio. I would ask him who his heroes were in radio and otherwise. I would ask him what's his favorite book. I would ask him what's the best movie you saw recently. I would ask him all these questions that nobody really ever asked him because nobody ever interviews him really at length. And just to talk to him as a person and see what he was like. I am not intimidated by famous people, especially if I'm interested in what they have to say. Then I'm not intimidated. I'm interested. I want to get to talk to them more. That's one of the reasons why I did the magazine and why I still do the radio show is at some every once in a while I want to talk to somebody, have an excuse to do it.
Same here. I don't who would mine be? I don't know. I can't that I've never talked to. You know what? Carl Sagan. He's dead, but I could use your phone because Greg has a phone where you can talk to dead people. Don't ask.
Yeah.
But yeah, if I could pick somebody who I wish was still alive and who should still be alive, it would have been Sagan. I think that would be an interesting conversation, but I can't. So that's within the weird world, say, of the paranormal. That's a tough one. I'd probably come back to Kaku. I like just having seen him and having had my one question with him and chatted with him very briefly afterwards. I think a 2-hour-long conversation with that guy, with the right person doing the conversation, and I tend to think the right person would be me or you or people that actually would really stretch out. Yeah, that guy or Stan, because I've known Stan for 30 years, but publicly I've never had a conversation with him where he and I have talked the way we talk privately. About all the various things that really sort of interest us. So my first rule of thumb would be no UFOs, but my second rule would be we're going to talk about some really cool things that we like that don't involve UFOs.
Yeah.
So there you go. The conversation I'd like to have with the person that I've never had a conversation with publicly would be Stan Friedman.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch more for me too. I mean, John Keel, but he's not around. Valet, who is still around, and everybody else has talked to him now. But I still have the questions I want to ask him.
Yes. Dean Radin, I haven't. I'd like to talk to Dean Radin. That would be fun. There's a lot of
5 hours and it changed my life. It's literally changed the way I thought about things. It changed the way I thought about reality, changed the way I thought about what is possible, changed the way I thought about what a scientist is. A lot of stuff. It changed. In fact, it's the longest section in Wake Up Down there. It's like 30-something pages because I printed everything he said instead of just part of it, which was what was in the magazine. Because it affected me so much, I figured I wanted the whole thing in there because I wanted other people to read that and maybe be affected similarly. That and Mario Pozzoglini, that was the other interview that really changed the way I thought about things. The alien writing guy who was a clinical psychologist in his real life, quote unquote.
Well, the great thing is the people that I really want to talk to, I mean, I'd like to talk to all these people, but the people I really want to talk to, I get to talk to. You, Nick. I don't get to talk to Mac anymore, but we did, so I can listen to those conversations. And as I said in the New York Times article, it's sort of like still having a conversation with him, reading his stuff or listening to it. So that's the wonderful thing that technology can give us. If we choose to use the tool, you can actually still sort of have a conversation with Mac Tonys. Some of who he was, you can go to his blog, Posthuman Blues, and it's not Mac, but you can see and in the article, his mother said something very interesting. She had never, I knew this, because his parents were not computer literate. They didn't even have
it. It had to be just to deal with finding out who he was and what he was into.
Yeah, she's gone back and she is reading all of his Posthuman Blues stuff day by day. So she's not skipping ahead. It's as if she's reading it the way he posted it.
Uh-huh.
And I find that fascinating. And she said, yes, it's his voice, absolutely. As I think she said in the article, it's his voice, it's absolutely Mac, and I'm learning things about my own son that, I didn't really know. And I think that's really cool. It's a shame the way it went down, absolutely. But, if you can take some good from some terrible stuff, there's still a way of learning more about the guy. You were talking before we came on, you're working on or beginning to work on a novel, and, Mac's short stories are there. So you were going to look up his short stories and stuff. Yeah, that's cool.
The reason I'm working on the novels because I asked Mac to collaborate on one with me based on all these ideas that we've talked about for years, and Mac and I talked about privately on the phone in those 3 or 4 hour long conversations. At about 3 months before he died, I said, hey, Mac, would you be interested in, taking all these ideas we're talking about and putting it in a format that's readily digestible to most people, meaning a story, a novelization of these ideas? He goes, oh, yeah. And the reason I asked this is because he can write fiction and I can't. Or he could write fiction and I can't. I was going to have him basically teach me to write fiction by going back and forth with him, looking at it and saying, Mac, tell me if it sucks, because if it does, I'll change it. And then if I was really that bad, he'd change it so it would sound good. But now I don't have that crutch anymore, and I figure I owe it to him to do that.
The same thing was true when we did Doing Time. The play, he was still live, so we did the play back and forth by internet, and then he got a chance to come out and see, he said, yes, this is his short story, did the play, fine. But the screenplay for the feature film, we didn't finish before he passed away, so it was left to me to finish it. And every time I sit down to work on it, it's like I have this conversation with Mac. Like, I don't say, what would Mac write? But as I go through it, every now and then I go, okay, is this true to his vision? If he was sitting here right now, would he laugh at this funny bit? Because I think it's funny.
It informs your thought process no matter what.
Yeah, and it's cool because there's really 3 of us, and 2 of us are still here. The one person who was in every version of the play was Christina Kafari, and she will be playing the lead in the film. So she and I are the 2 remaining people out of what I consider a troika of people who were there from the very beginning and are still there now. And so I send her the script on a regular basis, and every now and then she puts a little note like, Mac would really like this or something, because she got to know him too. And so there's that. Yeah, you're still having that conversation with him. You're still working with him in a weird sense. Yeah, it's interesting.
Which is why I have to go back and read some of his short story stuff and maybe some more of his posts again, because I haven't looked at any of his stuff since he's been gone.
My guest has been Greg Bishop. As always, it's been a tremendous amount of fun, and I'm sure we've bored most of you to tears if any of you are still listening, but we enjoyed it, and isn't that really the point at the end of the day? Greg?
Yes, that's all we've been saying throughout this whole thing, and not calling it selfish anymore, but calling it a journey to self-realization, or whatever you said earlier.
Yes.
Some hippie thing for a bunch of hippies.
Yeah, that's exactly what I say to myself to justify my use of online porn. It's a journey of self-realization. So it works for
brings a whole new meaning to the self-realization fellowship, which is located right next door to the Scientology building here in Hollywood.
I offer no comment other than one of my favorite pictures is you and I on either side with the L. Ron Hubbard Christmas setup that they had there, and both of us sort of pointing at it and saying, look, here's where Scientologists go for Christmas.
Yes, the L. Ron Hubbard. What was it? Holiday Fantasy something, or I can't remember what it's called. It doesn't mention Christmas or anything like that.
Yeah, no, it was like the Cthulhu Christmas or something. So, yeah. Oh, by the way, I finally saw the rest of the Coon episode on South Park with Cthulhu. So that was funny
Yes,
stuff.
I think that was the redeeming quality of that episode. Actually, was the Cthulhu part, which it's so weird seeing that stuff now. It's like, this is all the stuff my friends and I were laughing about like 10 or 15 years ago. Now it's on South Park.
It's pretty cool, isn't it?
It's cool and not cool at the same time. But the thing that pushes it over into coolness is that the rest of it's so damned funny.
Yes, exactly. Especially seeing Cartman trying to calm Cthulhu down by doing the kitty thing on his back. That was priceless.